as I'm waiting, I might as well give a start. So in the 16th century, and people here who have listened to me a little bit know how much I like the 16th century for a story, and they know that that's one of the things I like. And so one of the things that happened in the 16th century is that Catholics and Protestants didn't really get along. You may know that. That's a commonly known thing about the 16th century. They sort of detested each other. They had some big quabbles about God. If you Google it, you can actually go and you can look up Martin Luther's insults. There's a Martin Luther insult generator that you can get for any occasion. Some of them are a paragraph. Some of them are quite rude. So don't do it and then blame me for Martin Luther's words. That's not fair. But if you do want to Google it, you can see a little bit of what let's just say the state of the discourse was in the 16th century. And so Catholics, of course, were no less mean to Martin Luther. They did not like the guy and his ilk, but they were able to collaborate on one thing. And one thing they could agree on is that the forebears of the folks who would come or at least form an important part of our DNA, this is the American Baptist Church, it's a Baptist church, they agreed that they really did not like Anabaptists. They agreed that while each other were not great people, Anabaptists were really not great people. And so they really could agree on this, and they wrote letters back and forth, and they really collaborated and formed sort of a rich, almost collaborative relationship to see how they could persecute Anabaptists. They decided that would be a really good thing that we can finally work together on. I imagine somebody somewhere saying, well, this is perhaps finally how we can get together and we can figure out what it would be like to work together, and maybe it'll lead to more fruitful partnerships in the future with these Anabaptists. So these Catholics and Protestants who couldn't stand each other were unlikely allies. They were definitely not friends, but they collaborated nonetheless to great and devastating, and I would say pretty evil effect, but still, nonetheless, they were able to agree enough to trade a lot of information. The only letters that they would write to each other was about this. Isn't that nice? They were at least writing back and forth. And so these collaborations, when I think about that, and the one thing that they were able to agree on is that Anabaptists are just beyond the pale. And I think about what sort of strange collaborations are there out there in the world. You know some of them, of course. Politics, of course, has said it makes strange bedfellows. I think that that's definitely true. But those collaborations can be positive too. When I think of the partnerships that are formed to persecute Anabaptists or the partnerships that are formed in American politics, usually I'm not that excited about those partnerships. But they can be positive. So Jesus' words, those who are not against me are for me. So these words are different than what you might have heard people say about Jesus. And Jesus also says the other one, by the way, that those who are not for me are against me. That's the one that's used more commonly. And Jesus says that in another gospel. And, you know, it's a little messy which one is the one that Jesus actually said. Or maybe he said both to different audiences. Perhaps I'd like to think that could be true too. But I think that the Jesus that I know and the Jesus that I follow would probably be more likely to at least say, those who are not against me are for me. Don't worry about it. They don't have to sign the doctrinal creed. They don't have to be on this team officially for them to be able to do something that's good in the world. Casting out a demon being an ultimate really good thing to do in the first century, it seems like. It was a good thing. So it'd be like not insisting that someone agree with you about everything if they're out there doing a lot of good. And I think that sounds like something I can begin to get behind. And seems wise. Why make enemies when you don't have to? Why not have more friends? The people who aren't your enemies already, well, why don't we just go ahead and we'll count them as friends? And that seems really nice until you get to all sorts of different things that happen in the world. It's easier to talk about than it is to put it into practice. But we oftentimes go around and we pick these fights with people who don't agree with us. And we erect these barriers, and this is what I'd like to talk about a little bit. We erect these barriers in our hearts, these boundary lines between me and people like me and people who are not like me. We erect these boundaries between people who are worthy and people who are not worthy, between people who are capable and people who are not capable. We have these boundaries in our hearts. They're quite strong if we think about it. Usually they play a determining role in what sort of happens in our world, and they find physical form sometimes in our politics. And I think Jesus' words really inspired me to think about and consider what are those barriers, and how do we think about the barriers to compassionate action in our hearts? The barriers that keep us from thinking about friendship and collaborating, the barriers that keep us from thinking about who our friends are, the barriers that keep us from doing good. There are a lot of barriers in our heart, I would say. So we looked with awful shock, or at least I did, I'm sure you did, at the scenes of the Border Patrol hunting down Haitian refugees on horseback this week, rightfully condemned by a whole host of people. They make me wonder, and I paused to think about this week, just what were the preconditions for such a thing and in order to be given, that people should be rounded up by mounted border patrol and border enforcement? How did that even get to be an option at our disposal? What did that look like to move us to a place where that seemed like a sensible order to give? And so it made me wonder about why. And of course, that also wondering about why when it comes to immigration is also sort of something that is personal to me. Why are immigrants, like some of my family, my wife Anya and Zosha, they're Polish, why are they treated with compassion in some ways when other folks are not? When I was in a church, there was my previous church, there was a real outpouring of real compassion about our immigration process. And I think that, of course, has to do with, well, the people at my church knew me, the people out in the community knew me, but it also has to do with the fact that my family is white. I think that has a huge factor in immigration. It's a major thing that people, whether or not they acknowledge it, like I'm doing now, or whether or not they keep it really hushed up and they don't mention it, it is a boundary. It is whiteness, and white supremacy is a boundary, a border in our hearts that keeps us from compassionate action. It makes barriers between deserving and undeserving people, between those who deserve compassion and repair and those who don't. It makes it between people like me and you who are sitting at church and are worshiping and hearing great music. By the way, great music, I just want to say, really moving today. And those folks who deserve to be rounded up on horseback when they're in a camp under a bridge and their state has collapsed. Between those sorts of people and us. There are borders in our hearts that it is hard to cross. It seems that our hearts, in a lot of time, are what keeps us from embracing folks like Afghan refugees, where half our country seems to not want to deal with the fallout of our imperialism. That's difficult. It also, I would say, white supremacy often keeps us from knowing our history or knowing how we're bound up in history. That's really difficult stuff sometimes. I have a lot of conversations. Seems like Haiti's sort of constantly having a tragedy happen to it. So people will say, Haiti's so unlucky. It's such an unlucky thing. Like you might hear, it's poverty and isolation. It's just sort of a matter of circumstance. If it could quit getting hit by hurricanes, for instance, then it would be a-okay, no problem. But I would say that Haiti's sort of isolation, its poverty, its economic collapse, that is a feature and not a bug that has been put into the system. It's not an unintended consequence of our foreign policy or an unintended consequence of people acting in the world. It is the intention to isolate Haiti. I think that it just bears a little repeating, just so we can learn some history together, that Haiti is really close to us. It is in our hemisphere. It is really off our coast. And yet for 60 years after its independence, the United States refused to recognize Haiti. And the reason why it refused to recognize Haiti, of course, is that it was the result of a slave revolt. They won their independence in a slave revolt, and we refused to recognize Haiti. Someone that it seems like would be a natural thing to be excited about, because it's another freedom from colonization in our hemisphere, but because it was a slave revolt, we refused to recognize them. Then we enforced a debt of 150 million francs that was finally paid off a little bit after World War II. The debt that was owed by Haiti to France was put in place because of the price of slaves that were freed illicitly. To compensate for their own freedom, they had to buy it from France. And we were a big part of enforcing that and making it happen. Of course, those debt payments, it's hard to get an economy going when you have debt payments and no one in your hemisphere, the biggest trading partner, refuses to trade with you. We refused to recognize Haiti because of that slave revolt. After our independence, we refused to recognize another revolution in the Americas. Then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we militarily occupied it for 20 years here in the early 20th century, just almost as a footnote to some of those major structural things. And now I think that plays out in a major way in our refusal to see Haitians and the Haitian refugees under that bridge as people deserving of compassion. There is a border in Americans' hearts. This border must be crossed if we are to be real people of faith, if we are going to care about America's soul. The border is always in crisis. This is something you will hear in the news all the time. It's in crisis, it's in crisis, it's in crisis. It's been in crisis for a long time. But I think that the real border that's in crisis, the real crisis that's happening, is our crisis of compassion. The borders in our hearts divide people into camps of deserving and undeserving. It's racist. It's evil. That border can be enlarged, though. That's the promise of faith. I don't want to be pessimistic. I know I see a lot of dour faces, and I understand it's pretty dour stuff I'm talking about. But the promise of faith, if you're here on a Sunday morning, is that it doesn't have to be that way forever. That conversion happens to unlikely people in unlikely places, that people fundamentally change how they relate to one another. That is the promise of faith. If you're here, you at least believe, or you hope, or you want to believe in that promise. The promise is that you might be able to enlarge those borders in your heart so much that they dissolve entirely, or they're not even really there anymore. Certainly, that's what I've always felt Jesus, and how I've felt that faith is really moving us to a borderless existence, if we can. In our hearts, these borders on compassion that keep us from seeing what's really happening. Of course, the promise is that we can come to see that Haitian and Afghan refugees are not our enemies, but people fleeing failed imperial projects that, like it or not, we are bound up in, that we participate in. You know, I never mention this word in the pulpit, so you're going to have to forgive me, and I'm going to ask for amnesia after I mention it. But the Christian tradition has a way of talking about being bound up in systems that we did not create, but that we participate in nonetheless. It's sin. It's original sin. The fact that we didn't make it that way, and yet we still benefit from it. We still participate in it. Now, amnesia time, if that didn't work for you, excise it. It's okay. It doesn't have to work for you. What I say never works for everybody, and it's fine. But if that does work for you and it helps you reclaim part of the tradition, power to you. It helps me when I think about how I'm bound up with my own whiteness, how I have to wrestle with it, how I have to figure out just what is going on in imperialism in Haiti, and why is it that we just cannot relate to Haitians as siblings? What is that? That's the promise of faith, that we can wrestle with those things, that we can have enlarged borders in our hearts and perhaps not have them at all. Either faith inspires us to do those sorts of things, or I would say it ultimately means nothing. I've built my entire life on the assumption that faith does in fact mean something, that it is worth pursuing, that it can eradicate those borders, that it can lead to a conversion experience, that it can widen our scope, make us rich collaborators, willing to see friends where before we saw enemies, makers of peace. That's the promise of church. And I invite you to consider, what are the borders in your hearts? How did they get there? How did they play out and be made physically manifest in our society? It breaks my heart to see those images. Absolutely broke me open this week. And yet, of course, the border agent said, we're doing exactly what we trained to do and we followed protocol. I believe him. That's what's so damning about it. I believe him that that was the protocol. That's sick. There's a problem there. The problem starts in our hearts. I invite you to widen your borders, to widen your compassion. That's always been the ancient invitation. I make it again this morning, knowing that I preach in some ways to the choir, people who are willing to hear me talk about it. Thanks. That's great. That's why I like preaching here, because sometimes you can't say stuff like this from a pulpit, but I can, and I feel thankful. But even the choir can do more. Even the choir can expand its song, and that's the invitation that I'm giving. So I ask you, what are the borders of your heart? Can you commit this week to at least exploring what they are? And then can you commit over a course of a lifetime to completely deconstructing them, or at least widening them much further than they are? If you can, then you're really being a part of this project that is faith, that is church, that is moving towards a more capacious and generous existence. I'm on that journey with you. My heart has borders in it. It's not as wide as I would like it to be. I would like to think that our borders, though, could be like the universe, ever expanding. That is what I want. That's what I desperately want. If those images broke you open like they did me this week, then there's some introspection to be done to accompany all the political commentary. There's a lot of talk there. It's okay. I like the political commentary too. But look inside. How did that border agent get to do his job? Why was it okay? Why was it a functional order? It's because over time in history, the borders of our hearts got awful strong. It's time to break them down. Blessed be.